Well, hey there, fellow mystery seekers. Welcome to today's episode of Legends and Lore. I'm your host, David Culpepper, and before we dig into tonight's wild tale, I want to touch on something here. Stories like today's Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter are hard to just dismiss. These weren't just some random lights in the sky. We're talking about multiple witnesses, from children to adults, who all saw the same thing up close and personal. And it's not just this case. We've got thousands of similar reports from across the globe, many from highly credible sources: military pilots, police officers, astronauts. These people have nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward. Think about it. When an airline pilot with 30 years of experience tells you they saw something performing maneuvers that defy our known laws of physics, what's more likely? That they're lying or mistaken about what they've seen thousands of times before in the sky? Or that there's something out there we don't understand? What do you guys think? So, let's get into today's story, shall we? You know, some nights are just meant to be ordinary. The kind where you sit on your porch, maybe chat with family, watch the fireflies dance in the Kentucky twilight. That's exactly how the evening of August 21st, 1955 started for the Sutton and Taylor families. Just another quiet Sunday night at their farmhouse near the tiny community of Kelly, Kentucky. The cicadas were singing their summer symphony. The air was thick with that particular kind of August heat that blankets the South like a warm wool sweater you can't take off. But sometimes the ordinary dissolves into the extraordinary in the blink of an eye, or in this case in the flash of something metallic streaking across the darkening sky. When Billy Ray Taylor stepped out to get water from the family well, he had no idea he was about to witness something that would not only change his life, but would become one of the most compelling and terrifying close encounter cases in UFO history. What started as a curious sighting of strange lights would spiral into a night of absolute terror, with two families barricaded inside their farmhouse, firing shotguns at what they described as silvery goblins with glowing eyes and long, spindly arms that seemed to float across the ground. The bullets didn't stop them. The creatures just made a sound like metal hitting a bucket when shot, flipped backward, then righted themselves and kept coming. Can you imagine? You're there with your family, children crying, women praying, men loading and reloading their guns, and nothing, absolutely nothing, seems to keep these things away. The police would later count nearly 50 shell casings around the property. 50 attempts to defend against something that defied explanation. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's back up a bit and set the scene properly. It's important to understand what kind of place Kelly, Kentucky was in 1955. Picture a time before cell phones, before the internet, before people had a dozen different ways to document the unexplained. A time when rural families still got their water from wells, when a farmhouse's nighttime silence was broken only by the sound of crickets and the occasional passing car on a distant gravel road. A time when saying you saw something strange in the sky could make you the talk, and sometimes the laugh of the town, for years to come. And yet, these families chose to tell their story. They stuck to it through ridicule, through investigations, through decades of questioning. They gained nothing from their tale except unwanted attention and uncomfortable notoriety. So tonight we're going to dive deep into what has become known as the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter. Buckle up, folks. This is one of those cases that will make you question everything you think you know about what's possible in our weird, wonderful world. Let me take you back to that muggy Kentucky evening. The Sutton family farmhouse wasn't much to look at. Just a simple clapboard structure with no running water and no telephone. The kind of place where screen doors creaked and floorboards told stories of the feet that had walked across them. Inside were 8 adults and 3 children. gathered together for what they thought would be just another family visit. Billy Ray Taylor and his wife had come up from Pennsylvania to stay with the Suttons. Now, Billy Ray wasn't a man given to flights of fancy. A traveling carnival worker, he'd seen his share of oddities and tricks of light. He knew the difference between showmanship and reality. So when he came running back into the house around 7 p.m., eyes wide with excitement about seeing a bright light shoot across the sky and land in a nearby gully, the others were skeptical. You know how it goes. There's always that one relative who comes back from the well with wild stories, right? But here's where our tale takes its first real turn toward the bizarre. While the adults were still chuckling at Billy Ray's story, the family dog started raising absolute hell outside. Now, if you've ever lived in the country, you know farm dogs don't bark at nothing, at least not with that particular tone. That says something seriously wrong. Lucky, their dog, wasn't just barking. He was tucked tail and hiding under the house, whining like he'd seen something that shook him to his core. Elmer Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray decided to check it out. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and their natural curiosity, they stepped out into the gathering darkness. And there, in the growing shadows of dusk, they saw something that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. The creature was about 3 feet tall, with an oversized head that seemed to glow in the beam of their flashlight. Its eyes, described as huge and yellow, reflected the light like a cat's eyes, but much, much bigger. Its arms were long and spindly, ending in large hands with talons that seemed to float at its sides. I've always found it interesting how precise their description was. In an age before alien imagery was widespread in popular culture, before Close Encounters and E.T. shaped our collective vision of what extraterrestrials might look like, these rural Kentucky folks described something utterly unique, something that didn't fit any familiar pattern. Not a demon, not an angel, not any known animal. Just something otherworldly. The creature raised its arms, those impossibly long arms, and Elmer and Billy Ray did what any good old Kentucky boy would do in that situation. They shot at it. The creature flipped backward, then righted itself and scurried into the darkness. But this wasn't the end. Oh no. This was just the beginning of what would become one of the longest nights of their lives. A night where the impossible became possible, where the rational gave way to the irrational, and where a simple farmhouse became the front line in an encounter with something that defied explanation. The families had barely recovered from the first encounter when the creature started appearing at the windows. Now, imagine this scene. You're inside what should be the safety of your home, but every window becomes a potential appearance spot for these glowing-eyed visitors. One would pop up at the kitchen window, and just when the men would rush over with their guns, another would appear at the bedroom window on the other side of the house. It was like some kind of cosmic whack-a-mole, but with potentially hostile aliens. The children were terrified. The women were trying to keep everyone calm, and the men were burning through ammunition like it was going out of style. The most unsettling part, when they did manage to hit one of these beings, and they were sure they hit them multiple times, there was this weird metallic ping sound, like throwing a rock at a bucket. The creatures would float or flip backward, then just right themselves and keep coming. Bullets? Just a minor inconvenience, apparently. You know what's really wild about all this? At one point, one of these entities reached into the house through an overhang. Its hand, if you can call it that, was described as having rough, leathery skin with claws that looked like they could cut through metal. Mrs. Langford, the matriarch of the family, was sitting right there when this happened. Now, this was a deeply religious woman who'd probably never even read a science fiction book in her life. And here she was, staring at something that looked like it had stepped right out of, well, nowhere on Earth. The real kicker? These beings seemed to be almost playful in a terrifying sort of way. They'd approach the house, walking normally, but when shot at, they'd float or glide back into the darkness. Some witnesses described them as moving like they were on wires, though they couldn't see anything supporting them. It was like they were dealing with creatures that either didn't understand or didn't care about the laws of physics as we know them. So picture this. It's around 11 p.m., and these families have been dealing with their unwanted visitors for hours. The ammunition is running low. Nerves are completely shot, and they're all packed together in this farmhouse like sardines in a tin can. Finally, someone, and accounts vary on who, says what everyone's thinking: "We need to get out of here." Now, making a break for the cars was no simple matter. These creatures seemed to be everywhere outside, popping up on the roof, in the trees, around corners. But they noticed something interesting. The beings appeared to shy away from bright lights. So they formed a plan. They'd use the moment between appearances to make a run for it. What happened next was like something out of an action movie, but with terrified farmers instead of trained commandos. The entire group, all 11 of them, made a mad dash for their vehicles. They had the children sandwiched between the adults, everyone running full tilt through the darkness. Can you imagine running through a Kentucky night knowing these things could appear at any moment, probably hearing every twig snap and leaf rustle like it was amplified through a megaphone? They piled into 2 cars, and when I say piled, I mean piled. Personal space was not a priority at this point. They tore out of there like proverbial bats out of hell, gravel flying everywhere, and made a beeline for the Hopkinsville police station. Now, think about what that means for a second. These were proud, self-sufficient country folks, the kind of people who handled their own problems and didn't go running to the authorities unless things were really bad. And here they were, showing up at the police station in the middle of the night, some of them barefoot, all of them terrified. I mean, geez, can you imagine? The desk sergeant who greeted them probably had the shift of his life. Imagine, you're working the quiet night shift in small-town Kentucky, maybe doing some paperwork, maybe thinking about what's for lunch tomorrow, when suddenly your station is flooded with nearly a dozen panicked people talking about silver monsters with glowing eyes. But here's the thing. These weren't drunk teenagers or known troublemakers. These were respected members of the community. Some of them visibly terrified, all telling the exact same story. The police, to their credit, took it seriously. I mean, when you have 11 people bursting into your station, including children and a grandmother, all telling the same bizarre story with genuine terror in their eyes, you pay attention. Chief Russell Greenwell immediately organized a response team. We're talking multiple officers, state police, and even some military personnel from the nearby Fort Campbell Army Base. So this convoy of law enforcement heads out to the Sutton farm around midnight. Now imagine being one of those officers. You're probably thinking this is either going to be nothing, maybe some owls or pranksters, or it's going to be something that changes everything you thought you knew about reality. There is no in between here. When they arrived at the farmhouse, everything was quiet, almost too quiet if you know what I mean. The officers did a thorough search of the property. They found the shell casings, lots of them. They found the bullet holes. They even found strange luminous patches in the grass where the creatures had allegedly been shot. But the beings themselves, gone, vanished, like they'd never been there at all. The police did note several things that made them take this case seriously, though. First, all the witnesses told exactly the same story, even when questioned separately. Second, these were people known for their honesty and level-headedness. And third, This detail always gets me. When the families were convinced to return to the farmhouse with the police, the children became absolutely hysterical as they approached. You can fake a lot of things, but you can't fake that kind of raw terror in kids. The investigation continued into the early morning hours. The officers stayed until dawn, but our silver friends didn't make another appearance. It's almost like they'd decided their night of Kentucky hospitality was over. Though I have to wonder, did they get what they came for, or did they just get tired of being used for target practice? The morning after brought something almost as terrifying as the creatures themselves, the media. Word had gotten out, and suddenly this quiet Kentucky farm was swarming with reporters, photographers, and curiosity seekers. The story hit the newspapers faster than you can say little green men, though in this case they were silver. The Sutton and Taylor families found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight. People came from miles around to gawk at their property, trample through their fields, and pepper them with questions. Some tried to recreate the scene, others were just hoping to catch a glimpse of anything unusual. It got so bad that the families actually had to put up no trespassing signs, and started charging admission just to keep the crowds manageable. But here's what I find fascinating. Despite all the attention, despite the ridicule that inevitably followed, despite offers of money for their story, these families never changed their account. Not one detail. They didn't embellish it for the papers, didn't try to cash in with book deals or movie rights. They just wanted to be left alone to process what had happened to them. The Air Force investigated, of course. Project Blue Book, the government's UFO investigation program. Their official conclusion? Well, they suggested the families might have seen some monkey-faced great horned owls. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never seen an owl that could survive multiple shotgun blasts and flip through the air like an Olympic gymnast. Obviously, the case had a lasting impact on the families. Lucky Sutton, who'd been one of the primary witnesses, said years later, "I've never been through anything like that in my life. I never want to go through anything like it again." Some family members moved away. Others stayed but rarely spoke about that night. The incident affected them so deeply that even decades later you could see them physically tense up when asked about it. But perhaps the most interesting part of the aftermath is what didn't happen. Unlike many UFO cases of the era, no one ever came forward to admit it was a hoax. No evidence of trickery was ever found. The story never changed or expanded with time. It just was. A terrifying night in 1955 that defied explanation. You know what's really interesting? The Kelly-Hopkinsville case influenced a lot of later science fiction. Some people say it inspired elements of E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, even some episodes of The X-Files, but unlike those Hollywood versions, this story never got a neat resolution. No explanation, no answers, just questions that persist to this day. Well, let's dive into the theoretical rabbit hole, shall we? And trust me, some of these theories are wilder than a cat in a room full of laser pointers. The most commonly cited official explanation is the great horned owl theory. The Air Force and skeptics pointed out that owls can appear much larger than they are, especially in poor lighting, and their eyes do reflect light. But as many researchers have noted, this doesn't explain the metallic sound when shot, the floating movement, or how these owls could survive multiple shotgun blasts at close range. Plus, I don't know about you, but I've never seen an owl with arms long enough to reach through a roof overhang. Then there's the meteor theory. Some suggested that Billy Ray Taylor actually saw a meteor when he spotted the initial bright light, and the whole encounter was just mass hysteria triggered by an overactive imagination. But that doesn't explain the physical evidence found at the scene, or why 11 people would share the exact same hallucination. Here's where it gets really interesting. Some researchers have proposed that what the families encountered were actually experimental military robots or suits. Remember, this was during the Cold War and Fort Campbell wasn't far away. The metallic sound when hit, the mechanical movements, the apparent immunity to bullets, it kind of fits, right? Except, why would the military test such devices by terrorizing random civilians? One of the more out there theories suggests these were interdimensional beings rather than extraterrestrials. Proponents point to the creatures' ability to seemingly appear and disappear, their strange movements, and their apparent immunity to physical weapons. They argue these beings might have been passing through our dimension, maybe accidentally, maybe intentionally. Some ufologists have connected this case to what's called Project Green Fireballs, a series of mysterious aerial phenomena observed in the southwestern United States during that era. They suggest these creatures might have been some kind of reconnaissance team, studying human reactions and defenses. And finally, the local Native American histories. Some researchers have uncovered old legends from the region about metal-skinned visitors who would appear at night. These stories predate the 1955 incident by generations. Pure coincidence? Maybe. But it sure makes you think, doesn't it? You know, the fascinating thing about modern investigations is how new technology and research methods have allowed us to look at this case from angles that weren't possible in 1955. In the early 2000s, a team of investigators used advanced topographical mapping to study the layout of the property and surrounding area. They discovered something interesting. The gully where Billy Ray Taylor said he saw the craft land was actually part of a natural drainage system that led to several cave networks. Some researchers suggest these caves might explain where the creatures disappeared to when the police arrived, though of course that still doesn't explain what they were. In 2012, a group of forensic psychologists conducted a fascinating study. They analyzed the original witness statements using modern trauma response protocols and credibility assessment techniques. Their conclusion? The witnesses showed all the classical signs of people who had experienced genuine trauma. The consistency of their accounts, the specific details they recalled, and even their physical reactions years later when discussing the event, it all pointed to them having experienced something genuinely terrifying. One of the most intriguing modern investigations came from a metallurgist who studied the bullet impact patterns described in the police reports. He pointed out that the ping sound the witnesses described, when they shot at the creatures, matches the acoustic signature of bullets hitting a specific type of metal alloy, the kind that, interestingly enough, wasn't commercially available in 1955. But here's where modern investigation gets really wild. In 2019, a team using infrasound detection equipment at the site picked up some unusual readings. They found that the area experiences periodic bursts of very low-frequency sound waves, especially at night. Some researchers suggest this might explain the dog's extreme reaction that night. Dogs can hear frequencies humans can't, after all. And finally, the most recent investigation I know of was conducting thermal imaging studies of the property. They found several cold spots that don't seem to have any geological or structural explanation. Now, I'm not saying this proves anything, but it certainly added another layer of mystery to an already puzzling case. The Kelly-Hopkinsville case was actually a real game changer for how UFO investigations are conducted. Before this incident, most UFO reports were handled pretty casually, usually just a quick interview and maybe a glance at the site if investigators bothered to show up at all. This case changed all that. It was one of the first times investigators realized they needed a more comprehensive approach. For example, the police did something revolutionary for the time. They interviewed all witnesses separately and compared their stories. This is now standard procedure in UFO investigations. They call it cognitive interviewing protocol, but it all started with some Kentucky cops trying to make sense of a crazy night. The case also introduced what investigators now call environmental assessment. See, Chief Greenwell didn't just look for the creatures, he documented everything: shell casings, bullet holes, damage to the property, even the angle of shots fired. He basically created the template for modern UFO site documentation without even realizing it. This case was also one of the first to demonstrate the importance of what ufologists now call immediate response investigation. Because the police arrived while the witnesses were still in their initial state of shock, they were able to document their genuine emotional responses. Today, UFO investigators try to get to scenes as quickly as possible for this very reason. The case also established the importance of looking at physical evidence beyond just the typical lights in the sky. Modern investigators now routinely check for things like electromagnetic disturbances, unusual sounds, and animal reactions, all because of what was reported that night in Kelly. And perhaps most importantly, this case helped establish the credibility hierarchy that investigators use today when multiple witnesses of different ages, backgrounds, and education levels all report the same thing consistently over time. That's now considered one of the strongest forms of testimonial evidence in UFO cases. You know, in many ways, the Kelly-Hopkinsville case is like the Roswell of close encounter cases. It's one of those foundational incidents that modern researchers keep coming back to. But unlike Roswell, there's no government involvement to muddy the waters, no crashed materials to debate over, just regular folks encountering something they could not explain. In modern UFO research, this case holds a unique position because it checks so many boxes that researchers look for: multiple witnesses, physical evidence, consistent testimonies, and official documentation. But it also introduces elements that don't fit neatly into our modern understanding of the UFO phenomenon. These weren't your typical grays or disc-shaped craft. This was something different, something that almost seems to bridge the gap between traditional UFO encounters and what we might call paranormal activity. The case has become particularly relevant again with the recent increase in official UFO or UAP investigations. Modern researchers point to Kelly-Hopkinsville as an example of why we need to broaden our perspective. It's not just about lights in the sky or radar data. Sometimes it's about direct encounters that challenge our entire understanding of what's possible. What's particularly fascinating is how this case foreshadowed what we're seeing today. The witnesses described beings that seemed to defy physics, floating, being immune to conventional weapons, appearing and disappearing at will. Sound familiar? Because that's remarkably similar to some of the capabilities we're hearing about in modern UAP reports from military pilots and other credible observers. But perhaps the most important legacy of Kelly-Hopkinsville is how it reminds us that behind every UFO report, there are real people experiencing something profound. These weren't attention seekers or conspiracy theorists. They were just ordinary folks who had their world turned upside down in one terrifying night. And that's really what this case means for modern research. It reminds us to keep an open mind, to look beyond our preconceptions, and most importantly, to listen to witnesses with respect and attention, because sometimes the most incredible stories are told by the most ordinary people. And with that, fellow mystery seekers, we wrap up our tale of the night the Silver Goblins came to Kentucky. I'm David Culpepper. Thank you for listening to another episode of Legends and Lore. Until next time, keep watching the skies, and maybe keep a shotgun handy, even if it doesn't seem to do much good.